Good evening all, and welcome back to Fear Knocks. Deep in the Alaskan interior, the cabins sit far apart. Just dark windows, cold roofs, and long nights where every small sound feels louder than it should. Out here, generators breathe unevenly. Lake ice shifts under its own weight, and the wind carries things you only hear once. A glow moves beneath black ice where nothing should be alive. A cabin latch clicks ahead of falling pressure, as if something outside knows the weather before the instruments do. A generator drops into a flat rhythm, even though the meters show clean power. And a handheld radio brings up a mayday recorded last winter, drifting into tonight's channel on clear air. These stories come from real logbooks and SAR notes written during long winter rounds. One report in particular was nearly pulled from the file. You'll recognize it when we get there. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. And make sure the bell is on. We post new stories every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. It helps the channel grow and keeps the stories coming. All right, let's get into it. I was on duty with the search and rescue team, monitoring the radio at the regional dispatch office. It was deep winter in the Yukon Flats, the air a sharp, constant cold that seeped into the building's old frame. The first call came in as a routine check on a remote trapper's cabin, a standard welfare request. My name is Alex, and I have worked in this region for over a decade. The job involves long stretches of quiet, punctuated by sudden, intense periods of activity. Most calls are straightforward. A snow machine breakdown, a lost hunter, a medical emergency far from the highway. This particular night, the wind howled outside, a low, steady whisper against the frosted windows. The cabin in question was located deep within the Trapline network, a good distance from any established trail. Its resident, an older man named Elias, had not checked in for several days. That was not entirely unusual for Elias, but a relative had expressed concern. We prepared for a standard patrol, a two-person team on snow machines, carrying emergency gear and a satellite phone. The air temperature was well below freezing, and the forecast suggested a light fog might roll in later. Our routine was well established for these remote checks. We would confirm the coordinates, pack a survival kit, and ensure our snow machines were fueled and running smoothly. The generator hummed steadily in the shed outside the dispatch office, providing our power and light. We always carried a handheld radio, a GPS unit, and a powerful lantern. The vast frozen landscape of the Yukon Flats demanded meticulous preparation. The isolation out there was absolute, the nearest town many hours away by snow machine. We knew the terrain well, the frozen rivers, the dense forest patches, the expansive lake ice. Every trip was logged, every detail noted in our official file. We were trained to observe, to report, and to maintain a calm, procedural approach to every situation, no matter how unusual. We set out just after midnight, the snow machine headlights cutting twin beams through the dark. The cold was immediate, a physical presence that pressed against our gear. The snow was hard-packed, offering good traction. We followed a familiar trail for a while, then veered off onto a less used trapline. The GPS unit showed our progress, a steady line across the digital map. After about an hour of travel, we reached the edge of a large, unnamed lake. This lake was known for its thin ice in places, especially near the inlet where currents could keep the water moving longer into the season. We slowed our machines, listening to the subtle groans and cracks of the ice beneath us. The wind had picked up, carrying fine frost particles that glittered in our lights. It was then that we saw it. A light, steady and distinct, appeared on the ice surface, perhaps a mile or so ahead. It was a clear, white light, not flickering like a distant cabin lantern or a star. It seemed to be moving slowly, almost drifting. My partner Mark cut his engine, and I followed suit. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the wind's hush and the faint creak of the ice. We watched the light. It was too low to be an aircraft, too steady to be a headlamp on a person. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, gliding across the black ice. We checked our GPS. There were no known cabins or structures on this part of the lake. No traplines crossed this section either. We decided to investigate. We moved slowly, cautiously, keeping a good distance between our machines. The light maintained its steady pace, a silent beacon in the vast darkness. As we drew closer, perhaps a quarter-mile away, the light changed. It dipped as if submerging, and then reappeared under the ice. It was still visible, a diffused glow now, moving beneath the frozen surface. This was not possible. Nothing of that size with that kind of light should be able to move under solid lake ice. The ice here was at least a foot thick, maybe more. We stopped again, our engines idling, the hum a low thrum against the cold. The light continued its slow, deliberate crawl beneath the ice, heading towards the inlet. We dismounted our snow machines, pulling out the handheld radio. I tried to raise dispatch, but the static was heavy, a constant hiss that drowned out my voice. The cold was intense, biting at any exposed skin. We walked carefully towards where the light had submerged, our boots crunching on the hard snow. The ice surface was smooth and dark, reflecting the faint starlight. There were no tracks, no signs of anything having broken through. Yet, the light was undeniably there, a luminous point moving steadily beneath our feet. It was a surreal sight, completely outside of our experience. We took several photographs with our camera, hoping to capture the anomaly. The light seemed to be about a foot or two below the surface, a consistent, unwavering glow. We followed the light for some time, keeping a safe distance. It moved in a remarkably straight line, heading directly for the narrow inlet that fed into a larger river system. The GPS breadcrumbs we were dropping showed our own winding path as we tried to keep pace. The light's track, however, was perfectly linear, a precise, unwavering trajectory. The air felt colder now, a deep, pervasive chill that seemed to emanate from the ice itself. We could hear faint cracking sounds, not the usual settling of ice, but sharper, more deliberate. It was as if something was actively moving through the ice rather than just under it. The light was not a reflection. It was a source, a contained luminescence. As we approached the inlet, the ice began to thin, as expected. The light, still moving beneath the surface, seemed to accelerate slightly. We could see the dark water of the inlet ahead, a patch of open liquid in the frozen expanse. The light reached the edge of the thin ice, paused for a moment, and then dipped deeper, disappearing into the black water of the inlet. We rushed forward, stopping just short of the open water. We shone our powerful lantern into the darkness, but saw nothing. The light was gone. The water was still, reflecting only the distant stars. We stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping around us, the silence heavy and profound. We spent the next hour circling the inlet, scanning the water and the surrounding ice. We found nothing. No disturbance, no debris, no sign that anything had been there. The only evidence was our GPS track, which clearly showed our pursuit of a moving light across the lake ice. We made a detailed report to dispatch once we regained radio contact, describing everything we had seen. The incident was logged, and a follow-up investigation was initiated. We returned to the office as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the cold still clinging to our gear. Our camera files contained several blurry images of a faint glow under the ice, but nothing definitive. The official report noted an unidentified light source and unexplained subsurface movement. There was no plausible explanation offered. No known submersible craft operated in that region, especially not under the ice. No lost drones had been reported. The RCMP were notified, and a small team conducted a brief search of the inlet area a few days later, but found nothing. The incident was eventually filed away, an unsolved anomaly in the logbook. We never found Elias at his cabin. He had apparently left for town a week earlier, without informing anyone. His cabin was empty, the generator silent. I still think about that light sometimes. The way it moved, so steady and purposeful, under ice that should have been impenetrable. The silence of it, the cold it seemed to carry. I can still hear the wind's hush and the faint, unnatural cracking of the ice. It was a presence that simply was, and then was not. I was running my traplines in the Yukon Flats when the generator started to sound wrong. It was deep winter, the kind of cold that makes the air feel brittle. The usual steady hum from the power shed shifted into something else. My partner, Ben, and I maintained a remote cabin about 100 miles from the nearest paved highway. Our routine was set by the sun, or the lack of it, and the demands of the trapline. We would rise before dawn, check the snares and sets, and return to the cabin as the brief daylight began to fade. The generator was our lifeline, providing light and heat against the relentless cold. It was a robust diesel unit, housed in a small, insulated shed a short distance from the cabin. We kept meticulous records of its fuel consumption, oil changes, and voltage output. This procedural approach was essential for survival in such isolation. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, I noticed the change. The generator's hum, usually a consistent, high-pitched drone, began to dip. It wasn't a stutter or a cough, which would indicate a mechanical issue. Instead, the pitch would lower, hold for a few seconds, then rise back to its normal frequency. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible over the wind's constant whisper through the forest. I dismissed it as a trick of the cold. Perhaps a slight fluctuation in the engine's rhythm as it warmed. The next night, the sound was more pronounced. The wind had died down completely, leaving an almost unnatural stillness across the frozen lake ice. The air was sharp, well below zero, and the frost clung thick to every surface. I was inside the cabin, cleaning my gear by the light of a lantern, when the generator's tone dropped again. This time it held the lower pitch for longer, perhaps 5 or 6 seconds, before slowly climbing back. It sounded like a deep, resonant sigh. I glanced at Ben, who was sharpening a knife. He paused, his head tilted slightly. He had heard it too. We went outside, pulling our parkas tight against the biting cold. The sound was clearer out there, cutting through the silence of the night. It was a low, rhythmic thrum like a distant, heavy pulse. The generator shed stood dark against the snow, a small block of shadow. We walked towards it, our boots crunching on the hard-packed snow. As we approached, the sound seemed to intensify, yet it still felt diffuse, as if it emanated from the very ground beneath us. The generator's normal hum was still present, a high-frequency whine. But beneath it, this new, deeper note pulsed steadily. It was a flat, almost mournful sound, entirely out of place. I opened the shed door. The air inside was warmer, thick with the smell of diesel and exhaust. The generator sat on its concrete pad, vibrating steadily. Its exhaust pipe glowed a dull red in the dim light. I checked the fuel gauge. It was full. The oil level was good. I looked at the small digital display on the control panel. Voltage was stable. Frequency was correct. There were no warning lights. Everything appeared normal. Yet, the sound persisted. It was a low, guttural note, a rhythmic beat that seemed to resonate in my chest. It was not a mechanical grind or a loose part. It was a deliberate, almost musical tone, but off-key, like a note held too long on a cello. Ben stood beside me, his breath pluming white in the cold air. He pointed to the voltage meter. "It's clean," he said, his voice low. "No dips, no spikes." We stood there for a few minutes, listening. The sound would drop, hold, then rise. It was like a slow, deep breath. We checked the logbook, flipping through pages of meticulous entries. There was no record of anything like this. No previous anomalies, no unusual sounds reported. The generator had always been reliable, a constant presence. We closed the shed door, leaving the generator to its strange song. Back in the cabin, the sound was muffled but still present, a low thrumming beneath the floorboards. We tried the handheld radio, hoping to catch a weather report or any kind of dispatch from the outside world. All we got was static, a harsh hiss that filled the small space. The isolation felt heavier that night. We discussed possibilities. Could it be a resonance from the frozen lake ice? A strange atmospheric effect? But the sound was too distinct, too rhythmic to be a natural phenomenon. It was tied to the generator, yet the generator itself showed no fault. The rhythmic thrum continued for hours. It was like a slow, distant drumbeat, keeping time with some unseen pulse. We tried to ignore it, to sleep, but the sound permeated everything. It was a constant reminder of something fundamentally wrong, something that defied explanation. I kept thinking of the Yukon Flats, stretching out for hundreds of miles in every direction, empty and silent under the polar night. The sound felt ancient, out of place in our modern cabin. The next morning, the generator's hum was back to normal. The rhythmic thrum was gone. The air was still cold, but the silence felt different, heavier. We checked the generator again. Still no issues. The logbook remained clean. We continued our traplines, but the incident lingered. We spoke about it in hushed tones, trying to find a logical explanation. We even took a few photographs of the generator and its control panel, just in case. There was nothing to show, of course. The evidence was purely auditory, and it had vanished. We filed a detailed report in our field notes, describing the sound and the conditions. We noted the lack of wind, the extreme cold, the generator's normal readings. The report would eventually be reviewed by the regional office, then filed away. There would be no follow-up, no investigation. What could they investigate? A sound that came and went, leaving no trace? It was just another strange occurrence in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The incident became a quiet anecdote, something we rarely spoke about but never forgot. Sometimes, when the wind dies down and the night is particularly still, I can almost hear that low, flat hum again. It's a sound that has no place, a rhythm that keeps time with nothing. It reminds me of the deep, cold silence of the forest and the things that move within it, unseen and unheard. I was a search and rescue technician, assigned to routine checks of remote trapper cabins. It was deep winter in the Yukon Flats, the polar night making every day a long, cold twilight. The first sign of anything amiss was the unexpected silence from the cabin's usual radio check-in. My snowmobile headlights cut through the thick, still air as I approached the small structure. The cold was profound, a biting presence that seeped into every layer of clothing. I had been dispatched after the trapper, an old man named Elias, missed his scheduled radio contact for 2 days running. This was not like him. His cabin sat on a frozen lake, surrounded by a dense forest of spruce and birch. The only sound for miles was the low hum of my snowmobile engine, then the wind hush across the vast expanse of ice. As I drew closer, I noticed the generator shed was running, its familiar thrum a steady pulse in the quiet night. The air felt sharper than usual, a precursor to a storm. I parked the snowmobile and killed the engine, plunging the immediate area into a deeper silence, broken only by the distant generator. The cabin itself seemed to absorb the light, a dark block against the pale snow. There was no smoke from the chimney, which was another small detail that registered as odd. Elias always kept a fire going. Life out here was a constant negotiation with the elements. Trappers like Elias lived by a strict routine, dependent on their traplines and the weather. A missed radio check was always a red flag, signaling either equipment failure or something worse. My job involved understanding these rhythms, knowing the signs of trouble, and responding with precision. The cabin was a standard design, built for survival, with thick log walls and a heavy, insulated door. Inside it would be warm, lit by a lantern and the glow of the radio. Elias kept a meticulous logbook, detailing his catches, supplies, and weather observations. He was a seasoned outdoorsman, someone who understood the brutal isolation of the Yukon Flats. The generator was his lifeline, powering the radio and a few lights. Without it, he would be truly cut off. I carried my own handheld radio, a satellite phone, and a GPS unit. But even with modern gear, the vastness of the wilderness could swallow you whole. The cold was a constant, unforgiving presence, shaping every decision. I approached the cabin door, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The latch was a simple, heavy iron mechanism, designed to keep the door sealed against the fiercest winds. I knocked firmly, then again, waiting for a response that never came. The silence from within was absolute, more unsettling than any noise. I tried the latch. It was not locked from the inside. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the dim interior. The air was cold but not freezing, indicating the generator was providing some heat, though the wood stove was indeed out. A single battery-powered lantern sat on a small table, casting a weak, flickering light. The radio was on, tuned to our frequency, but only static filled the air. Elias was not there. His bunk was undisturbed, his gear neatly stowed. Everything seemed in order, except for his absence and the cold stove. I began my initial sweep, checking for any signs of struggle or forced entry. There was none. The cabin was exactly as Elias would have left it, save for the lack of a fire. On a small shelf near the door, I noticed a compact, motion-activated camera. It was pointed directly at the door and its latch. Elias had mentioned setting it up to monitor for wildlife or intruders. I retrieved the camera, hoping its memory card would offer some answers. As I did, a faint, metallic tap echoed from the door latch. I froze, listening. Nothing. I dismissed it as the cabin settling in the cold, a common occurrence. I checked the barometer hanging on the wall. It showed a significant drop, indicating a squall was approaching. I decided to wait for a while to see if Elias would return and to review the camera footage. I started a fire in the stove, the crackle of burning wood a welcome sound. The cabin slowly warmed. I connected the camera to a small portable viewer I carried. The footage showed the cabin interior, mostly still, for hours. Then, I saw it. Exactly on the hour, every hour, the heavy iron latch on the door would move. It was a slight, almost imperceptible shift, followed by 3 distinct, soft taps. Tap, tap, tap. The camera recorded this with chilling regularity. There was no visible force, no hand, nothing to explain the movement. The door itself remained closed, sealed tight. After each sequence of 3 taps, a fine powder of frost would visibly fall from the top of the door jamb, just above the latch. It looked like tiny ice crystals, disturbed and dislodged by some unseen vibration. The barometer, visible in the corner of the frame, would then show a noticeable drop in pressure, always within a few minutes of the taps. This pattern repeated itself over and over, captured by the camera for the past 2 days. The taps would occur, the frost would fall, and the barometer would drop. It was a precise, unsettling ritual. The camera showed no movement of the door, no one entering or leaving. Just the latch, tapping, and the frost, falling. The only other sound was the constant hum of the generator, a steady, mechanical drone. The wind outside had picked up, a low whisper. I watched the footage for what felt like hours, the rhythmic tapping becoming a maddening presence. It was not a creak or a groan of old wood. It was a deliberate, metallic sound. The camera's infrared vision showed no heat signatures near the door when the taps occurred. It was as if the latch was moving on its own. A small, heavy pendulum activated by nothing. The frost falling was the most tangible evidence of a physical event, yet its cause remained invisible. The implications were deeply unsettling. Elias had left, but not in a hurry. He had packed his essentials. But what had he seen or heard that made him leave his warm cabin in the middle of a polar night, just as a storm was brewing? The camera offered no answers, only this strange, repeating phenomenon. I replayed the footage, trying to find any detail I might have missed. The taps were always 3, always distinct, always followed by the frost. I walked over to the door, examining the latch mechanism closely. It was a simple, sturdy design, a heavy iron bar that dropped into a slot. No visible wear suggested it was loose or prone to spontaneous movement. I tried to replicate the taps myself, gently nudging the latch. It took a deliberate effort to make it move, and even then, it did not produce the same precise, rhythmic sound. The wood around the jamb was solid, showing no signs of rot or insect activity that might cause such a vibration. I stepped outside, circling the cabin in the deepening twilight. The wind was now a steady force, carrying fine snow crystals that stung my face. I checked the exterior of the door, looking for any tracks, any disturbance in the pristine snow. Nothing. My snowmobile tracks were the only fresh marks. The lake ice groaned and cracked under the increasing pressure of the cold, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the ground. I checked the generator shed, ensuring everything was running smoothly. The hum of the engine was constant, a reassuring sound. I returned inside, the cold seeping into my bones despite my heavy gear. Back inside, I consulted Elias's logbook. His last entry was from 3 days prior, a routine note about a fox catch and the dropping temperature. There was no mention of any unusual occurrences. However, I noticed a small, handwritten symbol next to the barometer readings for the past week. 3 small dots, arranged vertically. They appeared next to every significant pressure drop. Elias had been observing this phenomenon for longer than the camera had recorded. He had documented it, perhaps trying to make sense of it himself. The implications were chilling. He had known about the tapping. I decided to set up my own portable camera, aiming it at the door latch from a different angle, hoping to capture something the first camera missed. I also placed a sensitive microphone near the latch to record the sound. The wind outside howled now, a low, mournful whisper through the forest. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault, but these were natural sounds of a structure battling the elements. I waited. As the hour approached, I felt a growing sense of dread. The air in the cabin felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. Then, precisely on the hour, it happened again. The distinct tap, tap, tap from the iron latch. I saw it clearly this time. The slight, almost imperceptible shift of the heavy metal. Immediately after, a fine shower of frost powder drifted down from the door jamb, catching the weak lantern light. I looked at the barometer. It began to fall, slowly but steadily. My microphone picked up the sounds with unnerving clarity. There was no accompanying creak of wood, no draft sound, just the metallic taps and the faint rustle of falling frost. It was a mechanical action, devoid of any visible cause. The cold outside intensified and the wind shrieked. I felt a profound sense of isolation, a feeling that something ancient and unseen was at work in this remote place. I stayed in the cabin for another day, documenting everything. I recorded several more instances of the tapping, the frost, and the subsequent barometer drops. Each time the phenomenon was identical. I packed up Elias's logbook, the camera footage, and my own recordings. I left a note for Elias, should he return, stating that his cabin was secure and that we were looking for him. Before I left, I secured the cabin, double-checking the door latch. It felt solid, unmoving. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Elias was never found. Our search teams scoured the traplines, the lake ice, and the surrounding forest for weeks. We found no tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. His snowshoes were still in the cabin. The official report listed him as missing, presumed lost to the elements. My field notes, along with the camera files and audio recordings, were filed away as evidence of an unexplained occurrence. The incident was logged, but without a clear explanation. It remained an open case. The memory of those 3 taps and the falling frost stayed with me. Sometimes, especially when a storm front is moving in, I find myself listening. I hear the wind outside, the subtle creaks of my own home, and I wait. I imagine the heavy iron latch, somewhere in that remote cabin, moving with an unseen force. I picture the fine powder of frost, disturbed and falling in the dim light. The sound of those 3 taps, precise and deliberate, still echoes in my mind. It is a quiet dread, a reminder of things that operate beyond our understanding, in the deep, cold isolation of the wilderness. I was on night duty at the dispatch office. It was a clear, cold evening in late November. The radio crackled with an unexpected, distant signal. My shift had been quiet until then. The air outside was sharp, a few degrees below freezing, and the sky was dark, typical for the Yukon Flats at that time of year. I sat at the console, monitoring the various frequencies, mostly listening to the low hum of the system and the occasional static burst. The signal was faint at first, barely audible above the background noise. It sounded like a voice, distorted and broken, but definitely human. I adjusted the squelch, trying to clean it up. The voice resolved into a series of urgent, panicked words. It was a distress call, a mayday. The words were garbled, difficult to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. I tried to hail the sender, keying my microphone, but received no response. The signal faded, then returned a few minutes later, repeating the exact same sequence of sounds. This was unusual. A legitimate distress call would not loop like this. I logged the incident, noting the frequency and the approximate time of the transmission. The repetition continued, a ghost in the airwaves. Each time the same fragmented plea, the same rising panic. The cold outside seemed to press in on the small office. Our dispatch center served a vast, sparsely populated region. Most calls came from trappers, prospectors, or remote cabin residents, often dealing with equipment failures or minor injuries. Communication relied heavily on handheld radios and satellite phones, especially during the long polar night. The terrain was unforgiving, a mix of dense forest, frozen lakes, and winding river systems. Winter brought extreme isolation, with temperatures dropping far below zero. People out here understood the risks. They were self-reliant, but they also knew the importance of a clear radio channel. A genuine mayday was always taken seriously, triggering an immediate response. We kept meticulous logbooks, recording every transmission, every request, every unusual event. The integrity of the radio system was paramount for survival. This particular frequency was typically used by a handful of cabins along a specific trapline, a few hours north by snowmobile. The looped distress call continued to bleed into the channel. It was not a continuous broadcast, but rather a discrete burst of sound, repeating at an interval of about 7 minutes. Each time, the same sequence of garbled words, the same rising inflection of fear. I recorded the signal, running it through our audio analysis software. The system confirmed it was an identical audio file repeating. This was not a live transmission. It was a playback. I checked our archives, cross-referencing the frequency and the general content. We had a system for logging all distress calls, even those that were resolved quickly. After a few minutes of searching, I found a match. It was a Mayday call from last February, almost a full year ago. The log entry indicated the call had come from a cabin known as the North Fork Outpost. a small, privately owned structure deep in the forest, accessible only by trail or snowmobile. The original incident had been marked as unresolved. The logbook entry for that February call was sparse. It noted a single distress transmission, similar in nature to what I was hearing now. But it had faded out quickly and could not be re-established. A ground team had been dispatched at the time, but deep snow and extreme cold had hampered their efforts. They had reached the cabin after several days, finding it empty. No signs of struggle, no personal effects left behind. Just an abandoned generator shed and a cold stove. The owner, a man named Elias Thorne, had simply vanished. His snowmobile was still parked outside. The file had been closed as a probable disappearance with no body recovered. Now, that same recording was playing on my console. The implications were unsettling. How could an old recording from a missing person's cabin be broadcasting on an active frequency tonight? The air was perfectly clear. No atmospheric interference that would explain such a bleed-through. It was as if the past was reaching out, a whisper across the frozen landscape. I tried to contact other stations, asking if they were picking up anything similar. All negative. The signal was localized to my receiver, or at least to our immediate area. The hum of the equipment in the room felt heavier. The cold outside seemed to intensify. I listened to the loop again, trying to decipher more of the words. It sounded like someone was calling for help. Then a sudden cutoff, a sharp intake of breath, and then silence before the loop began again. The quality of the audio was surprisingly clear for an old recording, almost as if it had been captured just hours ago. The hair on my arms stood up. This was beyond unusual. This was something else entirely. I immediately notified my supervisor, Lieutenant Miller. He arrived at the office about an hour later, his face grim as he listened to the repeating signal. He confirmed the logbook entry for Elias Thorne. Miller was a veteran of the RCMP, accustomed to the strange occurrences of the northern wilderness, but even he seemed unnerved by this. We spent the next few hours trying to pinpoint the source of the broadcast. Our equipment indicated the signal was originating from the general direction of the North Fork outpost, the very cabin where Thorne had disappeared. It was a long shot, but we had to investigate. A small team was assembled. We prepared for a night journey across the frozen lake and through the dense forest. The temperature had dropped further, the air now biting, well below zero. The snow was hard-packed, making for a difficult trail. We traveled by snowmobile, our headlights cutting through the absolute darkness. The only sounds were the whine of the engines and the crunch of the snow beneath our tracks. The radio in my snowmobile was tuned to the frequency, and the loop continued to play, a constant, chilling companion. Each repetition seemed to drain more warmth from the night. We reached the vicinity of the cabin just before dawn, the first hint of gray light barely touching the eastern horizon. The cabin stood silent, a dark silhouette against the pale snow. The generator shed was still there, a small, squat structure next to the main building. There were no fresh tracks in the snow, nothing to indicate recent activity. The scene was exactly as described in the old report. We approached cautiously, our breath pluming in the frigid air. The cabin door was ajar, just as it had been found the previous winter. Inside, it was cold, colder than the outside air. A deep, pervasive chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Dust lay thick on every surface. On a small, rough-hewn table, next to a cold lantern, we found a handheld radio. It was an older model, a type commonly used by trappers. It was powered on. The battery indicator showed it was still active somehow. We picked it up carefully. The radio was broadcasting. It was the source. The same garbled distress call. The same loop, repeating every 7 minutes. It was playing directly from this device. There was no one else in the cabin, no other equipment. Just this one radio sitting on the table, broadcasting a ghost from the past. We took photographs of everything, documenting the scene meticulously. The silence of the cabin was profound, broken only by the chilling, repeating voice from the radio. We brought the radio back to the station. Our technicians examined it thoroughly. They found no explanation for how it could have been broadcasting an old, recorded distress call. The device had no recording function. It was a simple two-way radio. There was no internal memory, no mechanism for storing and replaying audio files. It was as if the sound itself had been imprinted onto the device, or perhaps the airwaves around it. The battery, against all logic, still held a charge, enough to power the broadcast for an unknown duration. The official report was filed. The incident was classified as an unexplained anomaly. The disappearance of Elias Thorne remained unresolved. The radio was eventually decommissioned, stored as evidence in a sealed file. We tried to find similar cases, but there were none. The event stood alone, a peculiar and disturbing footnote in our logbooks. The cold, logical procedures of our work offered no comfort, no explanation for what we had witnessed. The silence that followed the incident was almost as unsettling as the broadcast itself. Sometimes, late at night, when the dispatch office is quiet and the wind howls outside, I still hear it. Not on the radio, not in reality, but in my memory. The faint, garbled whisper of that distress call. The rising panic in the voice. It echoes in the back of my mind, a persistent hum. A reminder of the vast, cold emptiness of the northern wilderness. The sound of a past tragedy, bleeding into the present, with no clear origin, no logical end. It is a sound that stays with you, long after the official reports are filed and the files are closed. I was a search and rescue technician, assigned to a routine welfare check. It was late winter in the Yukon Flats, the air a sharp, constant cold. I found the first set of tracks leading directly to the cabin's generator shed, then, inexplicably, reversing themselves. My snowmobile had just pulled up to the trapper's cabin. The engine idled for a moment before I cut the power, letting the vast silence of the forest settle in. A thin layer of fresh powder had fallen overnight, perhaps an inch or so. It was enough to record any recent movement. The trapper, a man named Elias, had missed his scheduled radio check-in for 2 days. This was unusual for him. My job was to confirm his safety and assess the situation. The cabin stood isolated, a small structure of rough-hewn logs, nestled among a stand of spruce trees. The lake ice stretched out beyond the tree line, a vast, flat expanse of white. My routine began with a perimeter check. I always looked for signs of activity or lack thereof. The generator shed was the first stop. It was a small, sturdy building separate from the main cabin, housing the diesel unit that powered Elias's lights and radio. As I approached, my boots crunching on the frozen gravel path, I saw them. Large tracks, clearly ursine, pressed deep into the fresh snow. They were unmistakably bear prints. The size suggested a mature grizzly, perhaps one that had woken early from its den. The prints led a clear, direct path from the edge of the forest, across the open ground, and right up to the shed's single door. This was already a little odd. Bears usually kept their distance from human structures, especially in winter. But the truly unsettling part was the return path. The same set of prints, identical in size and depth, led directly away from the shed door, retracing the exact path back towards the forest. There was no deviation, no overlap, no sign of a turn. It was as if the bear had walked forward, then simply stepped backward, perfectly matching its own previous steps. I knelt in the snow, my gloved hand hovering over the prints. The edges were sharp, defined by the recent frost. There was no drag mark, no tail impression, nothing to suggest the animal had slid or stumbled. The powder within the prints was undisturbed, a clean impression. I followed the tracks back to the tree line, then returned to the shed. The pattern held, a perfect linear approach, followed by a perfect linear retreat, with no indication of the animal having turned around. It was physically impossible for a large animal to achieve this. My breath plumed in the cold air. The wind made a soft hush through the spruce needles. I pulled out my handheld radio, but held off on calling dispatch. I needed more information. Elias was meticulous about his security. He had a trail camera mounted on the corner of the generator shed, angled to cover the approach. It was a standard motion-activated unit, wired directly into the shed's power supply. I knew it would have recorded anything moving in that area. I tried the shed door. It was latched, but not locked. Elias rarely locked anything out here. I pushed it open. The interior was dim, smelling faintly of diesel and cold metal. The generator itself was silent. No hum, no vibration. This was another problem. Elias always kept it running, or at least ready to start. I flicked on my headlamp, its beam cutting through the gloom. The air inside felt even colder than outside. I located the trail camera's small monitor and control panel. It was a robust model, designed for extreme conditions. I navigated the menu, looking for recent activity. The camera had recorded motion. The log showed a sequence of images from the previous night, just before midnight. I scrolled through them. The first image showed the bear, a large grizzly, moving into the frame from the forest edge. It was walking steadily, purposefully, towards the shed. The next few frames showed it getting closer, its head low, its powerful body moving with a heavy grace. It reached the shed door. Its snout was close to the wood. Then the sequence ended. There were no images of the bear turning. There were no images of the bear moving away from the shed. The camera log simply stopped after the bear reached the door. It was as if the animal had vanished at that precise moment. I checked the camera's memory card, ensuring it hadn't filled up. There was ample space. I checked the battery. It was fully charged, drawing power from the generator's auxiliary line. The camera itself was functioning perfectly. It had simply stopped recording the bear's movement after it reached the shed. I stepped back outside, my mind trying to reconcile what I had seen. The tracks in the snow were undeniable. They showed the bear approaching and then retreating. The camera footage showed only the approach. The retreat was missing from the digital record, yet perfectly preserved in the physical snow. The cold felt sharper now, a gnawing presence. I walked the perimeter of the shed again, examining the snow from every angle. I looked for any disturbance, any sign of a struggle, any anomaly in the snow that might explain the impossible tracks. There was nothing. The snow was pristine, save for the perfect, reversing prints. I radioed dispatch. My voice was calm, measured, as I reported the situation. I described the tracks, the silent generator, the missing trapper, and the inexplicable camera footage. Dispatch acknowledged, their voice crackling with static. They would log the report and initiate a full search protocol for Elias. I was instructed to secure the scene and await further instructions, or the arrival of another SAR unit. The nearest unit was several hours away by snowmobile, even with clear trails. I spent the next few hours meticulously documenting everything. I took photographs of the tracks from multiple angles, using a scale ruler to ensure accuracy. I photographed the shed, the camera, the generator. I made detailed notes in my logbook, recording every observation, every detail, no matter how small. The isolation of the Yukon Flats pressed in around me. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the occasional crack of the lake ice in the distance. The sun, low in the sky, cast long blue shadows across the snow. I tried to restart the generator. It sputtered once, then died. The fuel tank was nearly empty. Elias was usually diligent about his fuel supply. This was another small deviation from his normal routine. I checked the cabin itself. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was cold but tidy. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, covered with a cloth. A book lay open beside it. It looked as if Elias had simply stepped out for a moment, perhaps to check his traplines, and never returned. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, nothing to suggest a violent departure. The only evidence of anything out of place remained the tracks in the snow and the incomplete camera footage. My report to dispatch was thorough, detailing the impossible nature of the bear prints. The official file noted the unusual circumstances but offered no explanation. Elias was never found. The search continued for weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of forest and lake ice, but yielded nothing. No body, no equipment, no further tracks. He simply vanished. The incident was eventually closed, filed as a missing person case with unusual contributing factors. I reviewed my field notes many times over the following months. The photographs of those tracks still sit in a secure folder. I still remember the precise way the snow was disturbed, the clean edges, the perfect, impossible reversal. Sometimes, when the wind howls just so, I can almost hear the crunch of those prints in the fresh powder. I can still see the bear, moving towards the shed, just before it disappeared from the camera's view. The memory of that silence, that deep, cold quiet, stays with me. I was performing a routine check of a remote trapper's cabin. It was deep polar night in the Yukon Flats. The air a sharp, dry cold. A small pennant on the porch railing whipped due east with no apparent wind. My job involved monitoring a series of off-grid cabins, ensuring they remained secure and stocked for emergency use. This particular cabin sat on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by dense forest. The nearest highway was many miles away, a long trail of packed snow and ice leading to it. I had driven my snow machine for several hours that day, the engine's hum a constant companion against the vast silence. The The generator shed behind the cabin provided a low, steady tone, a familiar sound of life in the isolation. I had just finished checking the fuel levels and making a logbook entry when I stepped back onto the porch. The pennant was a simple piece of faded red fabric tied to a short wooden post. It usually hung limp in the still air, or fluttered gently with any breeze. This time, it snapped taut, pointing precisely eastward, as if caught in a sudden, strong gust. I looked at the small handheld anemometer clipped to my jacket. The digital display showed 0. The air around me was completely calm. I felt no movement, no whisper of wind against my face. The frost on the railing remained undisturbed. I watched the pennant for a full 30 seconds. It held its direction, rigid and unwavering, then suddenly went slack. A moment later, the wind hit. It was a hard, sustained gust coming from the east. The anemometer instantly registered a significant speed, the numbers climbing rapidly. The cabin groaned under the impact. Fine frost particles, dislodged from the roof, drifted down like dust. The wind's sudden arrival, matching the pennant's impossible prediction, was unsettling. I stood there, feeling the cold bite through my layers, a new kind of chill settling deeper than the temperature. The incident was minor, almost negligible, but it left a distinct impression. I made a note of it in my field notes, a brief mention of an unusual atmospheric event. My routine was usually predictable, a series of methodical tasks. I would check the cabin's integrity, inspect the woodpile, ensure the radio was operational, and verify the emergency supplies. The generator was always a priority, its continuous hum essential for power and heat. The long nights of winter in this region meant constant vigilance against the cold and the encroaching darkness. I relied on my GPS unit for navigation, especially when the fog rolled in, obscuring the familiar landmarks of the forest. The isolation here was profound, a quiet that could feel heavy at times. I had grown accustomed to it, finding a certain peace in the vast emptiness. The next morning, the wind had died down, leaving behind a crisp, still cold. I had planned to spend another day at the cabin, performing some minor repairs to a loose shutter. As I stepped onto the porch, the red pennant was again pointing due east. The anemometer read 0. I stood motionless, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the generator. I waited. The pennant remained fixed, a silent, impossible indicator. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few seconds, it went slack again. The gust followed immediately. A sudden, powerful surge of air from the east. It was stronger than the one the previous night, rattling the cabin windows and sending a shiver through the structure. The anemometer spun wildly, displaying speeds that were concerning for the exposed location. This repetition, the exact same sequence of events, was no longer a mere anomaly. It felt deliberate, a signal. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter. The snow was undisturbed, a smooth, unbroken blanket. There were no tracks, no signs of anything out of place. The forest stood silent and unmoving beyond the cabin's immediate clearing. I decided to check the generator shed again. The hum was steady, the engine running smoothly. I shone my lantern into the corners, checking for any signs of intrusion or damage. Everything appeared normal. The air inside the shed was warmer, thick with the smell of diesel and exhaust. I stepped back out into the biting cold, the beam of my lantern cutting a path through the deep night. The pennant was now hanging limp, swaying slightly in the residual air currents. The wind had already begun to die down, leaving behind an even deeper quiet. I felt a growing unease, a sense of being observed, even though I knew I was alone for many miles. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a localized pressure system, a microburst forming just beyond the cabin's immediate vicinity. But the precise, consistent eastward direction and the exact timing seemed to defy simple meteorological explanation. I checked my handheld radio, ensuring it was fully charged and operational. The static on the frequency was minimal, a good sign for communication if needed. I took a few photographs of the pennant, both when it was limp and when it was taut, hoping the visual evidence might offer some clue later. The camera's flash briefly illuminated the frost-covered landscape, stark and unforgiving. The next morning, the pattern repeated. The pennant pointed east. The anemometer read 0. The gust followed. This time, I was ready. I had my radio on, tuned to the local weather channel. The forecast had predicted light winds from the north, not the east, and certainly not gusts of this intensity. The discrepancy was stark. I felt a cold dread begin to settle in. It was not the fear of a physical threat, but a deeper, more primal unease. The fear of something fundamentally wrong with the natural order. The cabin, usually a sanctuary, now felt exposed, vulnerable. I decided to investigate further, beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin. I packed a small bag with emergency supplies, extra batteries for the GPS and lantern, and my radio. I strapped on my snowshoes and headed towards the frozen lake. The ice was thick, groaning occasionally under the immense pressure of the cold. Each crack echoed across the vast expanse, a chilling sound in the profound silence. I walked about a mile out, checking the ice for any unusual formations or disturbances. The surface was smooth, covered in a thin layer of fresh frost. There was nothing to indicate any localized air currents or anomalies. As I walked, I kept an eye on the pennant back at the cabin, a small red speck in the distance. I saw it snap taut again, pointing east. I felt the familiar chill even at this distance. A few seconds later, the wind reached me, a strong, cold push from the east. It was as if the pennant was a conductor, a visual cue for an unseen force. The experience was deeply unsettling. I continued my patrol, checking the traplines I had set up a few days prior. Everything was undisturbed. The forest remained quiet, its branches heavy with snow. The isolation felt heavier than usual, almost oppressive. I returned to the cabin, the generator's hum a welcome sound in the encroaching night. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to make sense of the events. I reviewed my field notes, looking for any similar occurrences in previous years. There were none. The logbook entries from previous occupants also contained no mention of such phenomena. I considered calling dispatch, but what would I report? An impossible flag? An anemometer that lied? The incident felt too strange, too subtle to convey over the radio without sounding irrational. I left the cabin the following morning, the red pennant hanging limp in the still air. The wind had not returned. The journey back to the main office was long and quiet. I filed a detailed report describing the atmospheric anomalies and the pennant's behavior. The office reviewed my camera files and field notes. The official conclusion was an unexplained localized meteorological phenomenon, a phrase that offered no real explanation. The incident was logged and filed, becoming another piece of evidence in the vast collection of the unexplained. I still think about that pennant sometimes, especially when the wind picks up. I hear the winds whisper, and I remember the impossible prediction. The cold silence of the Yukon Flats holds many secrets. I was on a routine patrol, checking traplines for the Territorial Wildlife Service. It was deep polar night, the air well below freezing, and the only light came from my headlamp and the cabin lantern. That night, a second light moved across the window. My assigned cabin was a small, single-room structure, built from rough-hewn logs, nestled near the edge of a frozen lake in the Yukon Flats. The nearest highway was a full day's snowmobile ride away, and the isolation was absolute. My job involved monitoring wildlife populations, maintaining remote equipment, and occasionally assisting with search and rescue operations in this vast, uninhabited stretch of wilderness. I had been in this particular cabin for about 3 days, settling into the familiar rhythm of the polar night. The wind outside often created a low, constant whisper against the log walls. My only companions were the hum of the small generator in its shed a short distance away, and the occasional static burst from the handheld radio. I had seen many strange things in the backcountry, but never anything quite like this. My routine was simple and unvarying. I would wake before dawn, check the generator, and then prepare a hot meal. The days were short, barely a few hours of twilight, so most of my work was done under the beam of a headlamp or the steady glow of my propane lantern. I would spend the morning checking the nearest traplines, recording observations in my logbook, and collecting any data from remote sensors. Afternoons were for maintenance, repairing equipment, or chopping firewood. Evenings were quiet, spent reading by the lantern light, or making my daily radio report to dispatch. The cold was a constant presence, a sharp, biting force that seeped into everything. I had learned to live with it, to respect its power, and to always be prepared for its sudden shifts. The cabin, though small, felt like a secure haven against the vast frozen landscape outside. I was sitting at the small wooden table, cleaning my rifle when it happened. The cabin's single window, a small pane of thick glass, faced out towards the lake. My lantern, hanging from a hook above the table, cast a steady, warm circle of light across the interior walls. Suddenly, a second distinct glow appeared. It was a colder, whiter light than my own lantern, and it moved. It started at one edge of the window frame, a soft, diffuse halo, and then slowly traversed the glass, from left to right. It was as if someone was walking outside, carrying a powerful flashlight or another lantern, moving parallel to the cabin wall. The light was steady, unwavering, and deliberate in its passage. I froze, my hand still on the rifle. The wind outside had died down, leaving an almost complete silence, broken only by the distant, muffled hum of the generator. I watched the light complete its arc across the window, then disappear. My first thought was that a fellow trapper or a lost hiker had stumbled upon my cabin. It was highly unusual given the remoteness, but not impossible. I waited, expecting a knock on the door, or perhaps to see the light reappear. Nothing happened. The silence outside returned, thick and heavy. I waited for several minutes, listening intently, but heard no footsteps, no crunch of snow, no voice. The only sound was the faint crackle of ice settling on the lake. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to quicken its pace. I grabbed my headlamp and pulled on my heavy parka, hat, and gloves. My rifle was already loaded. I checked the radio, ensuring it was on and ready. The air inside the cabin felt suddenly colder, despite the warmth from the propane heater. I opened the heavy wooden door, stepping out into the absolute blackness of the polar night. The cold hit me immediately, a physical shock. I swept my headlamp beam across the immediate area around the cabin. The snow was undisturbed. There were my own tracks from earlier in the day, leading to the generator shed and the woodpile, but nothing else. No fresh boot prints, no ski marks, no sign of any recent passage. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing only the pristine, unbroken expanse of snow. I walked a wide circle around the cabin, moving slowly, my eyes scanning the ground for any disturbance. The snow was deep and powdery in places, firm and wind-scoured in others. Any person walking through it would leave clear evidence. I found nothing. I extended my search towards the lake, thinking perhaps someone had approached from the ice. The lake surface was a vast, flat expanse of frozen white, stretching into the darkness. Again, no tracks. The only marks were the faint, almost invisible lines of frost that had formed on the surface of the snow, catching the light from my headlamp. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. The light had been so clear, so distinct. It was not a trick of my eyes. Back inside, I removed my outer gear, feeling the chill deep in my bones. I walked over to the window and examined the glass. A thin, delicate halo of frost had formed around the edges of the pane, a common occurrence in such extreme cold. I touched the glass. It was icy to the touch. I looked out again, but saw only the impenetrable darkness. I tried to rationalize it. A reflection? But from what? My own lantern was stationary. The generator shed was too far away, and its light was dim. There was nothing else out there. I picked up the radio, my fingers fumbling slightly with the cold plastic. I pressed the transmit button. The familiar static filled the air, then the voice of dispatch, calm and clear. I reported the incident, keeping my tone as factual and unemotional as possible. They logged it, advising me to stay alert and to report any further activity. The rest of the night passed slowly. I kept the rifle close and I checked the window every few minutes. The generator continued its steady hum, a comforting sound in the overwhelming silence. I did not sleep. The cold seemed to intensify, seeping through the walls, making the cabin feel less secure. I kept the lantern burning brightly, its light a small defiance against the encroaching darkness. I spent the hours before dawn reviewing my field notes, trying to distract myself, but my mind kept returning to the image of that moving light. It was a simple observation, yet it carried a weight of unease that I could not shake. The lack of any physical evidence outside was the most disturbing part. When the first hint of twilight appeared, a pale gray smear on the horizon, I ventured out again. The air was still bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath crystallize instantly. I spent a full hour meticulously searching the area around the cabin, extending my search pattern further out onto the lake ice and into the surrounding forest. I took photographs of the undisturbed snow, documenting the absence of tracks. I checked the generator shed, the wood pile, even climbed onto the cabin roof to look for anything unusual. There was nothing. The snow was pristine, the forest silent, the lake a vast, empty expanse. It was as if the light had never been there, a fleeting illusion in the polar night. I filed a detailed report with dispatch later that morning, including my observations and the photographs. The official logbook entry simply noted unexplained light phenomenon. There was no follow-up, no further investigation. Without evidence, there was nothing to pursue. I completed my patrol, packed my gear, and left the cabin a few days later. The journey back to the highway felt longer than usual, the isolation more profound. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the distant tree line. I have been on many patrols since then, in equally remote locations. I have seen strange things in the wilderness, but that night in the Yukon Flats remains unique. The memory of that second lantern, moving steadily across the window, still comes to me sometimes. I can still feel the cold, the silence, and the quiet dread of seeing something that simply should not have been there. I was alone in the cabin, preparing for the long night ahead. It was deep winter in the Yukon Flats, and the light had already faded to a perpetual twilight. I noticed the kitchen clock had gained almost 10 minutes since I last checked it that morning. My routine in the cabin was a precise rhythm dictated by the cold and the darkness. I was a trapper, working a line that stretched for many miles across the frozen landscape. The cabin was my base, a small island of warmth and light in a vast, unforgiving wilderness. Power came from a diesel generator housed in a small shed a short walk from the main structure. I ran it for several hours each evening to charge batteries, run the radio, and provide brighter light. Most nights I would shut down the generator around midnight. The hum would cease, replaced by the profound silence of the polar night. The cabin would then rely on battery power for a few low-wattage lights and the handheld radio. This was standard practice for conserving fuel and extending the generator's life. The air inside the cabin would quickly grow sharper once the wood stove began to cool. That first evening, I simply reset the clock. It was an old battery-powered quartz model, a simple device that had always kept perfect time. I had replaced its single AA battery just a few weeks prior. I made a mental note to check the spare battery pack, just in case. The incident seemed minor, a small glitch in an otherwise predictable existence. The next morning, the clock was off again. It had gained exactly 9 minutes. I remember the precise number because it struck me as odd. Not a random drift, but a consistent, specific increment. I checked the battery with a multimeter. It read perfectly fine, showing a full charge. I reset the clock once more, making sure the time was synchronized with my GPS unit. I decided to observe the clock more closely. For the next few days, I kept the generator running longer, sometimes even through the night. During these periods, the clock kept perfect time. It was only when the generator was shut down and the cabin relied solely on battery power that the drift occurred. Each time, it was exactly 9 minutes. This pattern was unsettling. The cabin itself was a sturdy log structure, built decades ago by an earlier trapper. It stood on a slight rise overlooking a frozen lake, surrounded by a dense forest of spruce and birch. The nearest highway was a long day's snowmobile ride away, and the closest town was even further. Isolation was a given here, a condition I had always embraced. Now, it felt different. I began to feel a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere when the generator was off. The silence became heavier, more profound. The wind hush outside seemed to carry a different quality, a low whisper that was almost imperceptible. I found myself listening more intently to the subtle creaks of the logs as the temperature dropped. The frost on the window panes seemed to thicken faster. I started a small logbook, noting the exact time I shut down the generator and the time I restarted it. I recorded the clock's reading before and after. The data was consistent. 9 minutes gained. Every single time the generator was off for more than a few hours. It was a mechanical impossibility for a quartz clock with a fresh battery. I brought a second clock into the kitchen, a small travel alarm. I synchronized both clocks and then shut down the generator for the night. The next morning, the original kitchen clock had gained 9 minutes. The travel alarm, however, was perfectly accurate. This eliminated the possibility of a faulty clock. The problem was not the device itself. The implication was disturbing. Something was affecting the original clock, but only when the cabin was in full darkness, powered only by its internal battery. I considered electromagnetic interference, but there were no other devices running that could produce such a field. The handheld radio was off. The lantern was battery-powered, and the GPS was stored away. I spent an entire day checking the cabin's wiring. The main power line from the generator shed ran underground, then up into the cabin. I checked for any loose connections, any signs of rodent damage. Everything appeared sound. The cabin was old but well maintained. There was no static on the radio when I tested it. No flickering lights. The feeling of unease grew. It was a quiet dread, a sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the environment around me. The cold seemed to seep deeper into the cabin walls. The ice cracks on the lake outside sounded sharper, louder, like distant gunshots echoing across the flats. I found myself checking the locks on the door more frequently. One evening, I decided to leave the generator running all night. The constant hum was a comfort, a familiar presence against the vast silence. The clock kept perfect time. The next night, I shut it down. The following morning, the 9-minute drift was back. It was a direct correlation. The clock only gained time when the generator was silent. I tried an experiment. I took the original clock and placed it in the generator shed, powered by its battery, while the generator was off. The next morning, it had kept perfect time. This was baffling. The clock only drifted when it was inside the cabin, in the dark, without the generator running. It was as if the cabin itself, in its quietest state, was the catalyst. I began to feel a subtle pressure, a weight in the air when the generator was off. It was not a sound, but an absence of sound, a profound stillness that felt unnatural. I would sit in the dim light of a battery lantern, listening to the wind outside, and the silence inside would press in on me. I started to sleep less soundly, waking often to check the clock, even though I knew what it would show. The thought of an unseen presence began to form in my mind, a quiet whisper of an idea I tried to dismiss. It was not a ghost story, but a procedural anomaly that defied all logic. The clock was a simple mechanism. Its behavior suggested an external influence, but one that left no trace, made no sound, and only manifested in the deepest quiet of the polar night. I started taking photographs of the clock face, documenting the exact time before and after the generator shut down. I wanted evidence, something concrete to show if I ever had to explain this. The images were stark, showing the same 9-minute discrepancy each time. The cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a laboratory for an experiment I did not understand. The isolation, which had once been a source of peace, now felt like a trap. The vast expanse of the Yukon Flats, the endless forest, the frozen lake, they all seemed to hold their breath with me, waiting for the generator to fall silent. I found myself delaying the shutdown each night, clinging to the mechanical hum, the steady light. Eventually, I made the decision to leave. The clock had become a constant reminder of something I could not explain, something that felt deeply wrong. I packed my gear, secured the cabin, and prepared my snowmobile. The last thing I did was check the kitchen clock. I reset it one final time, knowing it would drift again once I was gone. I filed a report with the RCMP when I reached the nearest outpost. It was a strange report, detailing a malfunctioning clock and an inexplicable pattern. They logged it, of course, but there was little they could do. There was no evidence of a break-in, no damage, nothing tangible to investigate. The cabin was simply listed as temporarily unoccupied. I never returned to that cabin. The memory of the clock, gaining those 9 minutes in the silent dark, stayed with me. The file on the incident remains open, a curious entry in the logbook of remote occurrences. Sometimes, in the quiet of my own home, I still find myself glancing at the clock, half expecting to see it jump forward. The hum of the generator, the wind hush, the profound silence of the polar night. They all come back. I still hear it sometimes, that quiet, impossible drift. I was alone in the cabin, checking the radio. It was deep polar night, the air well below freezing. A faint, unfamiliar sound came from the roof. I had been living in this remote cabin for an extended period, conducting surveys and maintaining a series of traplines across the Yukon Flats. My background included years with search and rescue, so self-reliance and observation were ingrained habits. This particular cabin was a sturdy structure, built from rough-hewn logs with a corrugated tin roof, situated on the edge of a frozen lake. The nearest highway was a long day's journey by snow machine, and the isolation was absolute. The generator hummed its low, steady tone from the shed a short distance away, providing a sparse light against the overwhelming darkness of the Arctic winter. I had just finished logging the day's weather observations into my field notes when the first sound registered. It was a soft, metallic ping, distinct against the constant whisper of the wind. I paused, listening, but it did not repeat. I dismissed it as a random frostfall or a settling of the roof materials in the extreme cold. My routine was a precise rhythm of survival. Each morning I would start the generator, check the radio for any dispatch messages, and then head out to run a portion of my traplines. The lake ice was thick and stable, providing a clear path for the snow machine. Evenings were spent processing pelts, maintaining equipment, and preparing meals. The cabin was my world, a small island of warmth and light in a vast, cold wilderness. The sounds of this environment were familiar. The groan of the lake ice, the distant howl of the wind through the forest, the rhythmic thrum of the generator, and the occasional crackle of static from the handheld radio. I knew every creak of the cabin, every shift of snow on the roof. I relied on this intimate knowledge for my safety and sanity. The cold was a constant presence, a palpable force that shaped every decision. A few hours later, as I was preparing to shut down the generator for the night, the sound returned. This time, it was not a single ping, but a series of them. They were light, sharp, and metallic, like small stones dropped onto the tin roof. The pings were spaced evenly, perhaps a second or two apart, and they seemed to be moving. I stopped what I was doing, my hand hovering over the generator's kill switch. The sounds were too regular, too deliberate to be random. I walked to the cabin door, listening intently. The pings continued, a steady, rhythmic progression. They started near the eave on the lake-facing side of the cabin, then moved slowly, steadily, across the roof. The wind had died down to almost nothing, and the air was still, amplifying every sound. I could hear the distinct metallic resonance as each ping landed. It was not the sound of snow sliding, nor the heavy thud of an animal. It was too light, too precise. I grabbed my lantern and stepped outside, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp, biting sensation that stole my breath. The beam of the lantern cut a narrow path through the polar night, illuminating the cabin's side. I looked up at the roof. The snow cover was pristine, a smooth, unbroken blanket of fresh powder. There were no tracks, no indentations, no signs of anything having moved across it. Yet the pings continued, moving steadily towards the stovepipe. I walked around the cabin, craning my neck, trying to find a visual explanation. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed. The pings were now directly above me. Then they passed the stovepipe, continuing their linear path towards the back wall of the cabin. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The sound was unnerving in its methodical nature. It was a sound that should not have been there, a sound without a visible source. The last ping landed with a final, resonant tap, directly above the stack of ladder rungs leaning against the back wall. Then, silence. The generator hummed softly from its shed. The wind was still. The only sound was my own breathing, ragged in the cold. I stood there for a long moment, the lantern beam sweeping across the undisturbed snow. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I had heard with what I could see. There was no explanation. I walked the perimeter of the cabin again, slowly, methodically. I checked the snow around the foundation, looking for any tracks, any sign of disturbance. Nothing. The powder was smooth, unbroken. I circled the generator shed, ensuring the door was latched, checking for any unusual marks in the snow. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the generator. I returned to the cabin, my senses heightened. The isolation, usually a comfort, now felt like a heavy weight. I tried the handheld radio, hoping to reach dispatch, but the air was thick with static. The polar night seemed to press in closer. The forest, a dark, impenetrable wall. I spent the rest of the night awake, lantern burning, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. I checked the windows periodically, peering out into the darkness, but saw nothing. The cold seeped into the cabin, despite the stove burning steadily. I kept my rifle close, a familiar weight in my hands, though I had no idea what I would be aiming at. The lack of a visible cause was more unsettling than any potential threat I could identify. I logged the incident in my field notes, detailing the time, the nature of the pings, and the lack of any physical evidence. The pings did not return that night, nor in the days that followed. I continued my work, but with a heightened sense of vigilance. I checked the roof daily, looking for any change in the snow, any sign of a thaw or refreeze that might explain the sounds. There was nothing. The snow remained smooth, the tin roof silent. When I finally returned to base camp a few weeks later, I filed a detailed report, including my field notes and a series of photographs of the cabin and its undisturbed roof. The incident was logged, but without any conclusive findings. The official file remained open, categorized as an unexplained occurrence in a remote region. My colleagues, seasoned veterans of the northern wilderness, offered various theories: thermal expansion, ice shifting, even a rare type of wind phenomenon. But none fully accounted for the precise, linear progression of the pings. I still hear it sometimes, the distinct, metallic pings, walking across the tin roof in a steady, deliberate line. The sound echoes in the quiet moments, a reminder of something observed, but never explained. The vastness of the northern wilderness holds many such mysteries, and some of them leave a lasting impression. I was on a routine patrol, checking remote cabins along the Yukon Flats trapline. It was deep polar night, with temperatures well below freezing. The first irregularity was the generator shed door standing slightly ajar. My assignment involved monitoring the winter camps and ensuring everything remained secure until spring thaw. I worked for the regional SAR detachment, covering a vast, isolated territory. This particular trapline stretched for many miles, connecting a series of small, basic cabins used by local residents. Most were empty this time of year, locked up against the elements and opportunistic wildlife. My job was to log their status, check for damage, and report any anomalies back to dispatch. The cold was a constant companion, a heavy, pressing presence that shaped every action. The wind often carried a low, mournful hush across the frozen landscape. My snowmobile headlights cut a narrow beam through the pervasive darkness. The trail was mostly hard-packed snow, occasionally giving way to patches of exposed gravel where the wind had scoured the surface. I had been out for about 3 days, moving from one cabin to the next, making my notes and taking a few photographs. The routine was familiar, almost meditative. Each cabin had its own character, but they all shared the same stark isolation. The air felt sharp, biting at any exposed skin, even through layers of heavy gear. My radio crackled occasionally with static, a reminder of the distant world. I approached the third cabin on my current route just as the last sliver of twilight faded. The cabin itself was small, built from rough-hewn logs, nestled among a stand of spruce trees. A separate, smaller structure served as the generator shed, positioned a little distance away. As I cut the snowmobile engine, the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the faint creak of the trees in the cold wind. I noticed the shed door immediately. It was not fully open, but it was not properly latched either. A thin gap showed along the edge, enough to catch my attention. This was unusual. Every trapper I knew secured their property meticulously against the harsh winter. I dismounted, the snow crunching loudly under my heavy boots. My breath plumed out in thick white clouds, hanging in the still air for a moment before dissipating. I pulled my handheld radio closer, checking its signal. The generator shed was a simple affair. A small wooden box, designed to protect the equipment from snow and ice. Its purpose was to house the propane-powered generator that supplied electricity to the main cabin when occupied. I walked slowly towards it, my headlamp beam sweeping the ground for any tracks. There were none, only the undisturbed snow I was now breaking. The cold intensified as the last light vanished, making the air feel denser. Reaching the shed, I paused, listening. There was no sound from within, no hum of machinery, no scuttling of small animals. The door was a basic construction, a single sheet of plywood with a simple metal latch. The latch was still in the down position, but it had not engaged properly with the staple. It looked as if it had been closed quickly, or perhaps had frozen in place before fully securing. I reached out a gloved hand and pushed the door inward. It swung open with a soft groan of hinges, revealing the dark interior. I swept my headlamp inside. The shed was cramped, barely large enough for the generator and a few spare propane tanks. The air inside was still and intensely cold, matching the outside temperature. There was no sign of forced entry. No broken wood, no disturbed items. The generator sat in its usual spot, covered with a tarp. Two large propane tanks stood upright beside it, their valves clearly visible. Both were shut tight, as they should be. I checked the fuel lines, running my gloved fingers along them. Everything appeared intact. Then, I saw it. A faint white mist. A low-lying fog hung in the air inside the shed. It was not thick, more like a diffuse haze, but it was distinctly visible in the beam of my headlamp. It hovered at about face height, perhaps 4 or 5 feet from the floor. My first thought was a propane leak, despite the valves being shut. I leaned closer, trying to detect any smell. There was nothing, just the sharp, clean scent of extreme cold and old wood. The fog did not smell of propane. It looked like breath, like condensation. I took a step back, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Condensation fog forms when warm, moist air meets cold air. But the shed was unheated, and the air inside was as cold as the air outside. There was no source of warmth or moisture. No animals were present. I scanned the small space again, my light moving slowly, deliberately. The fog remained, a silent, unmoving cloud. It was too uniform to be my own breath, which would have dissipated quickly. This fog seemed to have a presence, a defined shape. I watched it for a long moment, my own breath now pluming out in front of me, adding to the general mistiness. The fog inside the shed did not mix with my breath. It stayed distinct, a separate entity. I felt a prickle of unease, a quiet dread that settled in my chest. This was beyond my usual procedural checks. This was an anomaly without a clear explanation. I reached for my radio, intending to report the strange observation, but hesitated. How would I describe this? A cloud of breath in an empty, freezing shed? As I stood there, watching, the fog began to move. It was a slow, deliberate drift, almost imperceptible at first. It did not swirl or dissipate. Instead, it coalesced slightly, becoming a little denser, and then began to track steadily towards the open doorway. It moved with a quiet purpose, a low, creeping current. My headlamp beam illuminated its slow progress. The air in the shed felt heavy, still, despite the movement of the mist. I could hear nothing but the faint wind outside and the distant, almost inaudible hum of my snowmobile cooling down. The fog reached the threshold of the shed door. It paused there, a silent, white barrier. I watched, transfixed, my hand still hovering near my radio. The cold seemed to press in on me, making my fingers stiff. Then, without warning, the metal latch on the outside of the door, which I had not touched since pushing the door open, began to lift. It rose slowly, deliberately, as if an unseen hand were raising it. There was a soft click as it cleared the staple. The door, still ajar, remained motionless. The fog, which had been dense at the threshold, began to thin rapidly as the latch lifted. It seemed to dissipate into the wider, colder air outside the shed, dissolving into nothingness. The entire process took only a few seconds. One moment the fog was there, distinct and unsettling. The next it was gone, leaving only the empty, freezing air of the shed. The latch remained in its raised position, a silent testament to what I had just witnessed. My heart was beating a little faster now, a dull thud against my ribs. I stood there for a long moment, trying to find a rational explanation. The cold could affect metal, causing expansion and contraction. But for a latch to lift so smoothly, so deliberately, at the exact moment the fog dissipated, it felt too coincidental. I stepped into the shed, my boots crunching on the packed snow. I checked the generator again, ran my hand over the propane tanks. Everything was cold, solid, inert. There was no residual fog, no lingering scent. The air was just cold, empty. I took out my camera and photographed the shed interior. The generator, the propane tanks, and the raised latch. The photographs would show nothing unusual, just an empty shed. I made detailed notes in my logbook, describing the fog, its movement, and the lifting latch. I focused on objective observations, avoiding any subjective interpretations. I noted the exact temperature, the wind conditions, and the time. I then secured the shed door, ensuring the latch was firmly engaged this time. It felt solid, normal. I returned to my snowmobile, the silence of the night feeling heavier than before. I started the engine, the roar a welcome sound in the vast emptiness. I radioed dispatch, reporting the cabin status and the unusual incident at the generator shed. I kept my voice calm, factual, describing the condensation and the mechanical anomaly. Dispatch acknowledged the report, noting it in the file. They asked if I required assistance or if there was any sign of a break-in. I confirmed there was not. I continued my patrol, but the incident stayed with me. The image of that silent, moving fog and the slow, deliberate lift of the latch replayed in my mind. I found myself checking every door, every latch, with renewed scrutiny at the subsequent cabins. The isolation of the Yukon Flats felt more profound, more watchful. The cold seemed to carry a new kind of whisper in the wind. The official report was filed, the incident logged as an unexplained mechanical anomaly, possibly related to extreme cold. No further action was deemed necessary. The photographs showed nothing out of the ordinary. I never found a logical explanation for the fog or the latch. I still think about that shed sometimes, the way the breath-like mist moved with such quiet purpose.